I had always believed that suburban life was supposed to be peaceful, quiet, and full of friendly neighbors. But that ideal was shattered the day Karen, the local HOA president, showed up at my door with a clipboard in hand and a scowl on her face. Little did I know, this encounter would spark a series of events that would uncover the darkest secrets of our neighborhood and forever change the way I viewed power, corruption, and the lengths people will go to control others. It all started when I decided to build a fence in my backyard. A simple, straightforward project. After weeks of dealing with a noisy, disrespectful neighbor, I decided enough was enough. I needed privacy. I had done my research, checked the HOA guidelines, and got the necessary permits. It seemed like a straightforward project, but Karen, who had always been a stickler for the rules, didn't see it that way. She was the HOA president and took her position very seriously. Or, I should say, took it as an opportunity to impose her will on others. The day I started construction, Karen appeared in my driveway, her eyes cold and calculating. She had that look of authority that always sent a shiver down my spine. Holding her clipboard, she marched up to me without even greeting me. "You can't build that fence," she said, her voice sharp. "You're in violation of HOA rules." I was taken aback. "What do you mean?" "I followed the guidelines. I have the permits," I replied, trying to keep my cool. "Don't argue with me," Karen snapped. "That fence is too high, and it's in the wrong location. I'm calling the cops." My jaw dropped. Calling the cops? Over a fence? I had followed every rule, every regulation. I had made sure my project was compliant. But Karen wasn't listening. She wasn't interested in facts or permits. She was in charge, and she was going to make sure I knew it. I tried to reason with her, but it was clear she wasn't going to budge. "This isn't just about a fence, Karen," I said. "I'm not breaking any laws. I don't understand why you're doing this." "You'll understand soon enough," she replied, turning and heading toward her house. "You'll see how this plays out." Moments later, the police arrived. 2 officers pulled up in their squad car, and Karen was standing there, ready to tell her side of the story. I could hardly believe what was happening. The officers were polite, but it was clear they didn't understand what was going on either. "You called the cops over a fence?" one of the officers asked, clearly confused. "Yes, officer," Karen said, looking all too pleased with herself. "This man is breaking HOA rules. The fence is an eyesore, and it's in violation of the community guidelines. I need it taken down." The officer looked at me, then back at Karen. "I don't see a problem here," he said. "You've got the permits. Everything seems to be in order." I felt a brief sense of relief, but Karen wasn't finished. "This isn't just about the fence," she said, her voice taking on an even sharper tone. "This is about control, about people thinking they can just do whatever they want without considering the neighborhood." The officers glanced at each other, clearly baffled by her behavior. "Look," one of the officers said, "we're not here to mediate HOA disputes. This is a civil matter. If you're following the guidelines, there's nothing we can do." Karen's face flushed with frustration. "This is an ongoing issue. He's violating the spirit of the HOA, and I'm not going to let it slide." The officers took one last look at the situation and gave me a polite nod. "We're going to have to let you handle it from here," the officer said, before turning and walking back to their car. Karen was furious. "This isn't over," she hissed at me before storming off. I knew this wouldn't be the last time I heard from her, but I thought that would be the end of it. Little did I know, Karen's phone call had set in motion a series of events that would eventually expose something much darker than just her petty HOA control. Over the next few days, things didn't settle. Karen was relentless in her efforts to get the fence removed. She sent letter after letter to me, threatening fines, more inspections, and even legal action if I didn't comply. But every time, I stood my ground. The more she pushed, the more I dug into the HOA rules, cross-referencing them with what was legally allowed. And that's when I started noticing something odd, something I hadn't seen before. The HOA guidelines were not just about maintaining the community. They were heavily slanted in favor of Karen's personal interests. I began to dig deeper into the HOA's financial records and land agreements. What I uncovered shocked me to my core. Karen wasn't just some overbearing neighbor. She was actively involved in a scheme to control vast portions of land in the neighborhood through the HOA. She was quietly consolidating ownership of properties, including the land around my own house. The HOA, which was supposed to be about maintaining the community, was actually a vehicle for Karen's secret land-grabbing operation. I found that Karen had been using her position to purchase properties cheaply, under the guise of community development. She had orchestrated a series of deals where the HOA bought up properties from homeowners who were either bullied into selling or were unaware of the true value of their land. She had created an entire network of fake community improvements that were actually just her buying up real estate, land that would later be resold at a massive profit. My heart sank as I pieced together the full scope of what Karen had done. This wasn't just about a fence anymore. She had been stealing land from the community, using her authority to manipulate people into selling their properties below market value, while she pocketed the difference. And I had been right in the middle of it, unknowingly buying into her game. But now that I had uncovered the truth, I knew I couldn't let this go. I had to expose her and stop her before she could claim even more land. I wasn't going to let her get away with this corruption. I started taking action, compiling evidence, and reaching out to other homeowners who had fallen victim to Karen's schemes. It was clear that Karen was using her HOA position to push her agenda, but I wasn't about to let her manipulate me or anyone else. I contacted the authorities, providing them with all the information I had gathered. It took some time, but the investigation finally began to take shape. The more they dug into Karen's dealings, the more they uncovered. She had been forging documents, bribing officials, and manipulating the entire system to her advantage. The entire network she had built was starting to fall apart. But even as the investigation progressed, Karen wasn't backing down. She hired an expensive legal team, making moves to protect her assets and keep the truth buried. She even went so far as to try to threaten me again, sending me more letters and trying to intimidate me into dropping the case. But by then, it was too late. The evidence against her was overwhelming, and there was no way for her to escape the truth. The investigation revealed the full extent of her illegal land deals, and it became clear that Karen had been running a massive scheme for years, exploiting the community for her own gain. And soon, she wasn't the only one facing the consequences. As the investigation gathered momentum, it became increasingly clear just how deep Karen's web of deceit went. The more we uncovered, the more disturbing the details became. She had not only manipulated the HOA system to benefit herself, but had also used it to push out longtime residents and take control of their properties without them ever realizing they were being taken advantage of. It wasn't just about the fence anymore. Karen's entire operation was one of exploitation, greed, and manipulation. The neighborhood had been under her thumb for years, with people too afraid or too unaware to stand up against her. She had made herself indispensable in the HOA, with everyone too scared to question her decisions. Now, though, the truth was starting to come to light, and the walls were closing in around her. I spent the next few weeks piecing together the evidence, working alongside the authorities and a small group of determined neighbors who had also been victims of Karen's actions. We found more fraudulent documents, more falsified contracts, and more people who had been manipulated into signing away their land for a fraction of its true worth. It was clear that Karen had been using her position to systematically push people out, often coercing them into selling their properties or threatening them with fines and legal action if they didn't comply. One of the most disturbing revelations came when I found a series of bank transfers that tied Karen to several developers who had been buying up the land she'd acquired through the HOA. They had been flipping properties for enormous profits, using Karen to facilitate the deals. I knew we had to act fast. The authorities were already aware of Karen's dealings, but this new information was the missing link they needed to bring down the entire operation. But Karen wasn't sitting idle. She had already started to put up defenses, hiring top-notch lawyers and working hard to discredit the investigation. As soon as she caught wind of the fact that we were making progress, she pulled out all the stops, trying to manipulate the narrative to paint herself as a victim, claiming that the charges were all part of a smear campaign. Her legal team tried to block the evidence we presented, arguing that it was circumstantial or that it had been improperly obtained. They even went so far as to accuse me of tampering with documents in an attempt to frame her. But we had anticipated this, and the authorities were already prepared to back up everything we had uncovered. The fraudulent documents, the financial records, and the testimonies from neighbors who had been wronged were all enough to prove that Karen had been operating outside the law for years. As the case against her grew stronger, Karen's behavior became more erratic. She seemed to be losing control, and it was clear that the pressure was starting to get to her. She started sending me more threatening messages, trying to intimidate me into backing off. But I wasn't scared anymore. I had seen how far she was willing to go to protect her empire, and I knew there was no turning back. One day, as I was leaving the courthouse after a particularly intense hearing, I saw her standing near my car, watching me with that same cold, calculating gaze. My heart skipped a beat as she stepped forward, blocking my way. "You think you've won, don't you?" she hissed. "You're nothing but a pawn in a much bigger game. You have no idea what you're dealing with." I stood my ground, my resolve hardening. "I know exactly what I'm dealing with, Karen. I know everything you've done, and it's all coming to an end." Her eyes flashed with anger, but she said nothing. For a moment, she just stood there, staring me down. Then, without another word, she turned and walked away. But I knew this wasn't over. Karen wasn't going to give up easily. She was going to fight to the bitter end, and I had to be ready for whatever she threw at me. As the trial approached, I continued to prepare, gathering more evidence and making sure every detail was accounted for. The authorities were now fully on board, and they had begun seizing Karen's assets, freezing her accounts, and shutting down her illegal dealings. It was clear that she was losing her grip on everything she had worked so hard to manipulate. But there was still one last hurdle to overcome: the jury. Karen's legal team was doing everything they could to sway public opinion in her favor, hiring PR specialists and making backdoor deals to get sympathetic media coverage. They tried to paint Karen as a misunderstood leader who had made a few mistakes, but was ultimately well-intentioned. But the truth was irrefutable. Karen's greed and manipulation had destroyed lives, and no amount of media spin could change that. The day of the trial arrived, and I sat in the courtroom, watching as Karen was led in, her face a mask of defiance. She still carried herself with that air of superiority, but I could see the cracks beginning to show. Her legal team had tried to make her appear innocent, but all the evidence we had uncovered was stacked against her. It was clear to me, and to the jury, that Karen had orchestrated a vast scheme of land theft and financial fraud. As the trial unfolded, the prosecution made its case, carefully presenting the evidence we had gathered. Witness after witness came forward, recounting their experiences with Karen and how she had used her position to exploit them. I watched as the jury listened intently, their expressions growing more and more incredulous with each new revelation. Karen's attempts to defend herself were weak at best, and it became clear that her reputation was in ruins. The final moments of the trial felt like a blur. The defense had presented their closing arguments, trying to salvage what little was left of Karen's credibility. But the case against her was airtight. The jury deliberated for only a short time before returning with a verdict: guilty on all counts. Karen's face went pale as the verdict was read. She had been defeated. The system had finally caught up with her, and there was no escaping the consequences of her actions. I felt a sense of vindication wash over me, knowing that Karen's reign of terror was finally coming to an end. But even as the judge pronounced her sentence, I couldn't help but wonder how far the corruption ran. Karen had been just one piece of the puzzle. There were still people out there who had benefited from her schemes, and I was determined to see them brought to justice too. The aftermath of the trial was intense. Karen had been sentenced, but the victory felt hollow for a while. As the dust settled, I knew the fight wasn't truly over. She had spent years building her empire of lies, and even though she was behind bars, the systems she had put in place were still functioning. The real estate deals, the under-the-table payments, the questionable zoning laws, none of that had disappeared overnight. The corruption had been far-reaching, and I knew that the only way to ensure justice was served was to keep pushing forward. I couldn't rest until I made sure that Karen's associates faced consequences too. She hadn't worked alone, and the people who had enabled her, those who had turned a blind eye or even profited from her shady deals, still needed to be exposed. My attorney and I began working with the authorities to investigate the people who had been complicit in Karen's criminal activities. As we dug deeper, we realized just how many lives Karen had destroyed and how many people had benefited from her reign of terror. One of the most shocking revelations came when we discovered that some of the key figures in the corruption network had close ties to local government officials. These weren't just greedy developers or opportunistic investors. These were people in power who had used their influence to turn a blind eye to the law. They had worked with Karen to manipulate property values, enrich themselves, and leave the rest of us in the dust. I wasn't about to let them get away with it. I had come this far, and I wasn't going to back down now. I spent the next few weeks tracking down documents, interviewing former employees of Karen's real estate operation, and talking to other homeowners who had been affected by her actions. The more I learned, the more determined I became. It wasn't just about holding Karen accountable anymore. It was about dismantling the entire corrupt system she had built. The authorities were working tirelessly to follow the money trail, but they needed more information to take down the higher-ups involved in Karen's scheme. They couldn't do it alone. So, I made the difficult decision to go public with what I had learned. I reached out to the local media, hoping to expose the full extent of the corruption and put pressure on the remaining people involved. It was a risky move. I knew that going public would draw attention, and not all of it would be positive. Karen's allies were still out there, and they wouldn't take kindly to being exposed. But I couldn't afford to be afraid anymore. The truth had to come out, and I wasn't going to let anything stop me. The story hit the front pages within hours. The media was buzzing with the details of Karen's fraud, but the real shocker was the revelation that local government officials had been complicit in her scheme. The corrupt land deals, the fraudulent zoning approvals, everything was out in the open. The public outrage was immediate, and the pressure on the authorities to act was overwhelming. But even as the media frenzy continued, I could feel the pushback. Karen's allies were moving quickly to cover their tracks, destroying documents, shifting assets, and trying to discredit anyone who spoke out. I started getting phone calls from anonymous sources, warning me to back off, threatening my safety if I didn't drop the investigation. They were trying to intimidate me into silence, but I wasn't going to let that happen. One evening, just as I was preparing for another round of meetings with the authorities, I received a strange package at my door. It was a small, unmarked envelope with no return address. My heart raced as I opened it, finding a stack of photographs inside. At first, I didn't understand what I was looking at, but as I studied the images, it became clear. They were photos of me, taken from a distance. Someone had been watching me. The photographs were accompanied by a note that simply read, "Stop digging, or things will get worse." I felt a chill run down my spine. The threats were becoming more personal. I wasn't just up against Karen anymore. I was up against an entire network of people who had far more to lose than I did. But I couldn't stop now. I had come too far. I couldn't let these people continue to ruin lives just to line their own pockets. I contacted my attorney immediately and shared the photos with the authorities. They took the threat seriously and increased security around my home. But I wasn't going to let fear stop me. I had a mission to complete, and nothing was going to stand in my way. As I continued to work with the authorities, more pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. We uncovered evidence of illegal land acquisitions, fraudulent contracts, and bribes paid to city officials. It became clear that Karen had been part of a much larger operation, one that spanned several neighborhoods and involved developers, lawyers, and politicians. The scope of the corruption was staggering, and I realized that the battle was far from over. But with each new discovery, the walls around Karen's operation grew thinner. The authorities were making arrests, and the web of deceit was slowly being unraveled. I could feel the momentum building. Karen's allies were starting to turn on her, and more people were coming forward with information that would help bring down the entire network. The community was starting to heal. Neighbors who had once been too afraid to speak out were now sharing their stories, and it was clear that the tide was turning. People were beginning to trust each other again, and Karen's grip on the neighborhood was slipping away. The once feared HOA president was now a pariah, her reputation in tatters, her empire collapsing around her. But as the investigation neared its conclusion, I knew there was still work to be done. The people who had been complicit in Karen's schemes were still out there, and they were just as dangerous as she had been. But for the first time in a long while, I felt a sense of hope. The fight wasn't over yet, but the light at the end of the tunnel was getting brighter. The more we dug, the clearer it became that Karen's operation had been far more extensive than we had initially realized. The network of corruption she had woven wasn't just local. It had roots in other neighborhoods, and possibly even in the city government. Karen's ability to manipulate people, to bend the rules in her favor, was frightening. It wasn't just about taking advantage of the people who lived near her. It was about exploiting the system itself. One afternoon, I received a call from an anonymous source. The voice on the other end was shaky, as if the person was afraid of being overheard. They claimed to have information about the next phase of Karen's plan, something I hadn't anticipated. According to the source, Karen was preparing to liquidate more of her assets, including several properties she had secretly acquired over the years. These properties weren't just sitting idle. They were being prepared for resale, and Karen had set up a network of fake buyers to push the sales through at far below market value. The source also revealed that Karen had been working with a group of contractors who had been falsifying property values, inflating the worth of the homes she was trying to sell. This made her scheme even more insidious. She wasn't just acquiring property and flipping it for a profit. She was manipulating the market, creating a false narrative of supply and demand to her advantage. I shared the information with my attorney, and we agreed that we had to act quickly. The authorities were already investigating Karen, but this new piece of the puzzle could be the key to taking her down for good. We contacted the authorities again, providing them with the new information. They launched an immediate investigation, and soon enough, the police were raiding several of Karen's properties, looking for evidence to support the allegations. It was a tense few days as we waited for the investigation to progress. I couldn't help but feel a little anxious. Karen was a master manipulator, and I knew she wasn't going to go down quietly. She had friends in high places, people who were willing to cover her tracks. But this time, she was cornered. There was no way out. As the investigation unfolded, we found more and more damning evidence. The police uncovered records showing that Karen had been using her position as HOA president to pressure homeowners into selling their properties at below-market prices, often by threatening them with fines or other penalties if they didn't comply. The land deals she had orchestrated were nothing short of criminal, and the developers involved were now facing charges of their own. But there was still one critical piece of the puzzle missing. We knew Karen had been profiting from these illegal land deals, but what we didn't know was where the money had gone. I dug into her financial records again, this time focusing on the transactions that were harder to trace. That's when I found something that made my stomach drop. A series of wire transfers to offshore accounts linked to known money laundering operations. This was it. This was the breakthrough we needed. I immediately contacted the authorities, and they began working with international financial institutions to trace the money. It wasn't long before they confirmed that Karen had been funneling millions of dollars through these offshore accounts, laundering the proceeds from her illegal property deals. This was no longer just about a corrupt HOA president. This was about a full-blown criminal enterprise that had been operating under the radar for years. As the walls closed in on Karen, she grew more desperate. She stopped showing up for court dates, and her legal team started using every delay tactic in the book to stall the proceedings. But the evidence was undeniable. The authorities were determined to bring her to justice, and every day, more pieces of her criminal network were being exposed. Meanwhile, the community continued to recover from the shock of it all. People who had been afraid to speak out against Karen's reign of terror were now finding the courage to come forward. Neighbors who had been too intimidated to challenge her before were now sharing their stories of manipulation, coercion, and fear. It was heartening to see the community come together, united by the common goal of holding Karen accountable for the harm she had caused. But just when I thought we were getting closer to the finish line, Karen made one last-ditch attempt to save herself. She hired a high-profile attorney, someone with a reputation for getting the impossible cases dismissed. This lawyer immediately filed a motion to have all the charges against Karen dropped, claiming that the evidence was inadmissible and that the case had been mishandled from the start. It was a bold move, and I could feel the tension building. The stakes had never been higher. The court date for the motion was set, and I found myself preparing for yet another battle. The prosecution had been confident in their case, but this new defense strategy was a curveball. I knew that Karen's legal team would do everything they could to derail the case, but I also knew that the truth was on our side. As the hearing began, I sat in the courtroom, my heart pounding in my chest. Karen's attorney made his case, trying to argue that the evidence against her was weak and circumstantial. But the prosecution had anticipated this move, and they were ready. They presented new evidence, documents that had been recovered from Karen's properties, along with witness testimony that corroborated everything we had uncovered. The judge listened carefully, weighing the arguments. I held my breath as she deliberated. For what felt like an eternity, the courtroom remained silent, each second stretching longer than the last. And then, at last, the judge spoke. "The motion to dismiss is denied," she said, her voice firm. "The evidence against the defendant is overwhelming. This case will proceed." A wave of relief washed over me. Karen had just lost her final chance to escape justice. The case was no longer in her hands. She had fought with everything she had, but now she would face the consequences of her actions. I could see the shock on her face as the reality of her situation set in. There would be no more delaying tactics, no more manipulation. The game was up. Karen's expression was unreadable as she sat in the courtroom, her defense team now visibly shaken. It was evident that her last hope of evading justice had been crushed. The motion to dismiss was denied, and now all we could do was wait for the trial to move forward. The days felt like they were stretching out, but I knew that the end was near. However, Karen's ability to twist the system to her advantage was not something I would underestimate. She still had the power to pull strings, to leverage whatever she had left to fight back. But for the first time, I felt confident. With the evidence we had uncovered, her offshore accounts, the manipulation of homeowners, the fake land deals, it was becoming clear that Karen had no escape. Her network of corruption had unraveled, and with each passing day, she was losing more ground. I kept my head down as the trial date loomed closer, trying not to get distracted by the threats that continued to trickle in. The anonymous phone calls, the strange messages, the people watching my house. Nothing could deter me now. It wasn't just about me anymore. It was about the entire community that had been affected by Karen's actions. I couldn't let fear control me. During this time, I spent hours meeting with the investigators, helping them piece together the last bits of Karen's financial dealings. Her connections to powerful people in the city were more extensive than anyone had anticipated. The more we uncovered, the more I realized how much deeper her influence had stretched. Karen had been playing a dangerous game for years, and now, every corner of her operation was being exposed. One morning, as I sat in my living room going over the case files, my phone buzzed. It was a message from Sarah, one of the homeowners who had suffered the most from Karen's manipulation. Sarah had been forced to sell her property under duress and at a fraction of its market value. She had been one of the first people to speak out about Karen's actions when the investigation began, and her testimony had been pivotal in building the case. "I have more information," the message read. "You need to meet with me. It's urgent." I didn't waste any time. I grabbed my things and drove to Sarah's house. When I arrived, she was waiting at the door, looking anxious. "What's going on?" I asked, stepping inside. Sarah motioned for me to sit down. "I've been going through some old documents," she said, her voice trembling. "I found something that connects Karen to a much bigger operation. I think she was laundering money through the HOA, using the property deals as a front to hide funds. It's much bigger than we thought." My heart sank as Sarah handed me a stack of papers. The documents were bank statements, emails, and contracts, more evidence of Karen's involvement in illegal activities. There were several transactions that seemed to lead to shell companies, ones that had been set up in offshore accounts. But what really caught my eye was a series of emails between Karen and a developer that mentioned kickbacks for approving fraudulent land sales. "This is huge," I said, my mind racing as I read through the emails. "This could be the smoking gun we've been looking for. If we can prove she was involved in money laundering, this could bring down her entire network." Sarah nodded, her eyes filled with fear. "I know, but you have to be careful. The people Karen's working with are dangerous. They won't go down without a fight." I agreed. This was no longer just a matter of holding Karen accountable. It was about exposing the larger criminal network she had been involved with. I knew that once the full extent of her operations came to light, the authorities would have to act quickly. But they couldn't do it alone. We needed to make sure this evidence made it to the right people. I contacted my attorney immediately, and together, we presented this new evidence to the authorities. It was clear now that Karen's corruption had reached beyond just land deals and HOA violations. It was part of a much larger money laundering operation that had affected countless individuals and businesses. The authorities launched another round of investigations, and this time, they focused not just on Karen, but on the entire network of corrupt developers and city officials involved. The pressure on Karen and her associates was mounting. They could feel the walls closing in. And just as I expected, they started pulling every dirty trick they could think of to protect themselves. It wasn't just legal tactics anymore. Karen's associates were trying to silence anyone who stood in their way. I received more threats, more warnings to back off. But I wasn't backing down. I continued working with the authorities, making sure every piece of evidence was documented and that all the leads were followed. But as the investigation deepened, I began to realize just how close Karen's criminal enterprise had come to toppling the very foundation of the community. The land that Karen had stolen from homeowners, the bribes she had accepted, everything she had built was a house of cards, ready to collapse. One day, as I was reviewing the latest batch of evidence, I received a call from the authorities. They had found something else, something that changed everything. It was a wiretap, a conversation between Karen and one of her developers, discussing how they had manipulated the local zoning laws to increase property values artificially. They had been orchestrating illegal land deals for years, and the corruption went all the way to the top. "This is it," my attorney said over the phone. "We've got them now. The wiretap is the final nail in the coffin." I could hardly believe it. After all the months of investigation, all the work we had put into this case, it was finally paying off. Karen's network was crumbling, and there was no way they could deny it anymore. The authorities moved quickly, issuing warrants for the arrest of the developers and city officials who had been complicit in Karen's schemes. The web of corruption was being torn apart, piece by piece. Karen had been at the center of it all, but now, she was just one part of a much larger story. The truth was finally coming out, and the community was starting to heal. But even as Karen's empire collapsed, I knew that there was still work to be done. The fight wasn't over yet. There were still people who needed to be held accountable, still corruption that needed to be exposed. But for the first time in a long while, I felt like we were on the right path. Karen had been defeated, but the ripple effects of her actions were still being felt. As the investigation into Karen's network gained momentum, the scope of her operations continued to unfold in unexpected ways. What had begun as a simple attempt to confront a corrupt HOA president over a petty dispute about a fence had transformed into a far-reaching case that threatened to implicate several high-profile individuals in the city. The more we discovered, the more I realized that Karen had carefully built her empire over many years, and now, with each layer peeled back, her grip on the community was slipping faster than she could control. With the authorities now investigating the developers and city officials involved, things began to move quickly. Arrests were made, documents were seized, and soon, the details of the widespread corruption were being leaked to the press. News outlets began reporting on the scandal, and what had once been a neighborhood feud had turned into one of the biggest corruption cases in the city's history. Karen's name was everywhere, and people started coming forward with their own stories of how she had manipulated them. But the legal battles were far from over. Although Karen was behind bars, the court proceedings were only just beginning. Karen's defense team, though defeated in many respects, wasn't giving up. They continued to file motions, appeal decisions, and try to stall the case for as long as they could. It became clear that Karen was hoping to outlast the pressure, to wear down the prosecution and the authorities, and maybe, just maybe, get away with a reduced sentence or even a plea deal. I couldn't let that happen. The more I thought about everything Karen had taken from me, from my neighbors, from the community, the more determined I became to see this through. The truth had to come out, and the people who had helped Karen had to face justice too. The authorities were working tirelessly, but I knew that without the constant push from people like me, the case could easily lose steam. One day, I received another call from Sarah, the neighbor who had originally helped me uncover Karen's fraudulent land deals. She had been following the investigation closely, and her voice on the other end of the line was filled with urgency. "I have more information," Sarah said. "You're not going to believe this, but Karen wasn't just manipulating the HOA and selling property at a fraction of its value. She was working with a group of shady contractors who had been getting kickbacks to build properties on land she'd illegally acquired. These properties were being sold to unsuspecting buyers who had no idea they were buying into a corrupted system." I felt a pit form in my stomach. This wasn't just about property deals anymore. This was about people's homes, their lives. Karen wasn't just profiting off real estate. She was actively ruining lives in the process. "What do you mean? What kind of contractors?" I asked, my mind racing. "Some of them are linked to the city's development department," Sarah continued. "They've been inflating property values, making it seem like the development is legitimate. In reality, these homes were built with substandard materials and were often put up in areas where they shouldn't have been allowed to build at all." It was a shocking revelation, but it also explained so much. The manipulation of zoning laws, the false promises of development, the unlivable homes being sold to unsuspecting buyers. Karen had orchestrated it all. I immediately contacted my attorney, and we worked with the authorities to get more information. The extent of Karen's corruption was beyond what anyone had expected, and as more evidence was uncovered, it became clear that this wasn't just an isolated scheme. This was a systemic problem that involved multiple parties working in tandem to exploit the real estate market and deceive the public. Days turned into weeks, and the legal battles continued. The court hearings were long, and Karen's legal team did everything in their power to drag the process out. But the evidence was mounting, and the authorities were committed to seeing this case through. Karen's former allies began to turn on her, with some cooperating with investigators in exchange for immunity or lighter sentences. As they spilled the details of the operation, Karen's empire slowly collapsed. The authorities seized more properties connected to Karen, freezing assets and investigating the contractors and city officials who had been part of the scheme. It was clear that Karen had used her position as HOA president to manipulate the system and take advantage of both the law and the people she was supposed to be serving. Despite all the progress, I knew that Karen wouldn't go down easily. She had been a master manipulator for years, and now that she was facing the consequences of her actions, she was willing to use any means necessary to try to wiggle out of her situation. She sent letters, made phone calls, and even tried to sway public opinion with stories of how she had been wronged by the system. But the more she fought back, the more the community turned against her. It wasn't just the homeowners who had been victimized anymore. It was the entire neighborhood, now united in their quest for justice. Karen had done everything she could to divide us, but now we were stronger than ever, and we weren't going to let her tear us apart again. It wasn't just about exposing Karen anymore. It was about sending a message. It was about showing that corruption, no matter how well hidden, could be uncovered, and that those who thought they were untouchable could be brought to justice. The fight was hard, and at times, it felt like we were up against an insurmountable force. But the more we worked together, the more confident I became that we could win. Karen had made her enemies, and we were all standing together, united. Then, one day, I received an email from an anonymous source. The subject line read, "The Final Piece." Inside, there was a PDF attachment with details that would blow the case wide open. As I opened it, my heart raced. The document contained detailed records of Karen's dealings with a shadowy group of investors, people who had helped her launder money through fake property transactions. It was the missing link we had been waiting for. This was it, the smoking gun that would bring down everyone involved in her network. It was time to take everything to the authorities and end this for good. I quickly forwarded the email to my attorney, knowing that this new evidence was more than enough to push the case into its final stages. The authorities acted swiftly, and within a day, they had already moved to seize more of Karen's assets and began following up on the new leads in the document. The details of her connections with shadowy investors revealed the true scale of her operation. Karen wasn't just a corrupt HOA president. She had been at the heart of a much larger scheme involving illegal property deals, money laundering, and bribery that had spanned years. As the investigation ramped up, Karen's lawyer immediately filed for a motion to dismiss the new evidence, claiming it was illegally obtained. This was expected. Karen's legal team had been attempting to stall the case at every turn, but this time, it wasn't working. The evidence was solid, and the more they fought to suppress it, the more they revealed how desperate they were to keep her from being convicted. The authorities contacted me to inform me that they had begun tracking down the investors named in the documents. They were working on piecing together how Karen had manipulated the system, how she had used her influence over zoning laws to secretly enrich herself and her partners. The more they uncovered, the clearer it became that Karen had orchestrated an elaborate scheme to control not just her neighborhood, but large parts of the city's real estate market. One of the most shocking discoveries came when the authorities uncovered a secret ledger of Karen's financial dealings. It contained the names of several high-profile figures, bankers, contractors, and even city officials who had been working alongside Karen to carry out the land grabs. The real estate deals she had conducted were just a small part of the equation. Karen had been receiving kickbacks from these investors in exchange for helping them bypass regulations and zoning laws. She had effectively sold the city's land to the highest bidder, all while lining her own pockets. The more we learned, the more disgusted I became. These were people who had sworn an oath to serve the public, to protect the interests of their constituents, and yet they had been secretly exploiting the very people they were supposed to protect. The web of corruption was far more extensive than I had ever imagined, and Karen had been at the center of it all. She was no longer just a local nuisance. She was part of a much larger criminal network that had infiltrated the heart of the city's real estate sector. It wasn't long before the first arrest was made. One of Karen's main collaborators, a powerful real estate developer, was taken into custody on charges of fraud, bribery, and money laundering. As more people were arrested, the full scope of the operation began to take shape. The authorities were moving swiftly now, and Karen's empire was crumbling around her. But the thing that shocked me most was that some of these people weren't just low-level criminals. They were highly respected figures in the community, people whose influence had allowed them to avoid scrutiny for years. With each new arrest, it became clear that Karen wasn't just a corrupt HOA president. She was a cog in a much larger machine, one that had been working behind the scenes for years to undermine the integrity of the city's real estate market. And what struck me the most was how ordinary people, like myself and my neighbors, had been caught in the crossfire of this elaborate scam. We had been forced to live under the oppressive thumb of someone who had abused her power for personal gain, all while manipulating us into selling our homes at a fraction of their true value. But despite the momentum of the investigation, there was still a sense of unease. Karen's allies were still out there, and I knew they wouldn't stop until they had protected themselves. The more we dug, the more dangerous the situation became. The people involved in Karen's network had a lot to lose, and they were willing to do whatever it took to keep their secrets buried. I had already received threats, but now, with the case reaching its climax, it felt like the stakes were even higher. I started to get more anonymous messages, warning me to stay out of the way, telling me that if I didn't stop digging, I'd be next. The messages were vague, but the threats were clear. It wasn't just about the legal battle anymore. It was about keeping the truth from coming to light. The more I uncovered, the more desperate Karen and her associates became. One afternoon, I received a particularly disturbing message. It wasn't a phone call this time, but a letter. The envelope was plain, with no return address. But when I opened it, my heart sank. Inside was a picture of my house, taken from across the street. There was a simple note scribbled on the back. "You're next." The threats were escalating, and I knew they weren't going to stop. I had become a target, and there was no way I could ignore the risks anymore. But I also knew that I couldn't back down. The truth needed to come out. If I stopped now, all the hard work, all the evidence, and all the people who had suffered because of Karen's actions would be for nothing. I couldn't let that happen. I contacted my attorney and the authorities, explaining the situation. They took the threat seriously and increased my security. But I knew that I couldn't rely solely on them. This had become a battle not just for justice, but for my safety. I couldn't let fear dictate my actions now. Not when the end was so close. I had to stand firm, no matter what. As the days passed, the pressure continued to mount. The authorities were getting closer to Karen's final downfall. They had already seized several of her properties, and they were now preparing to take her assets. But I couldn't shake the feeling that Karen wasn't going to go down quietly. She still had too many cards to play, and I had no doubt she would use whatever she could to protect herself. But even as the danger grew, I felt more determined than ever to finish what I had started. The fight was almost over, and the truth was finally coming to light. The authorities were closing in on the last few people who had been involved in Karen's schemes. The corrupt network she had built was unraveling, and justice was finally within reach. The investigation was reaching its final stages, and Karen's empire was starting to crumble. The authorities had seized her assets, arrested several of her key allies, and exposed the full extent of her corrupt network. It had been a long and exhausting journey, but I could finally see the light at the end of the tunnel. The community, once paralyzed by fear, was coming together. Neighbors who had been too afraid to speak out were now sharing their stories, and I could sense the collective relief. It was time for the final court hearing. Karen was sitting in the defendant's chair, her once imposing presence reduced to nothing more than a shell of the person she had been. Her arrogance, her confidence were gone. The trial had lasted for months, and now it was all coming to an end. The evidence was overwhelming, and the prosecution had done its job. There was no escaping the truth. The judge's voice rang out in the courtroom, pronouncing Karen guilty of all charges. The room erupted into a mix of relief and quiet applause. Justice had been served. Karen's manipulations, her schemes, her grip on the community had all been exposed for the world to see. She was no longer the powerful HOA president, the figurehead who had run the neighborhood from the shadows. She was just another criminal, held accountable for her actions. As I walked out of the courthouse, a weight seemed to lift off my shoulders. The ordeal was over, but the lessons remained. The truth had won, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like I could breathe again. This victory wasn't just mine. It was a victory for the entire community. The people who had suffered at Karen's hands, the ones who had been too afraid to speak up, now had a chance to rebuild. The neighborhood could finally move on, free from the fear and corruption that had once dominated it. If you've enjoyed this story and want to see more incredible battles for justice, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to stay updated on the latest stories. Thanks for being part of this journey with me.